Modern clinical psychology generally treats the mind through the medical model, the same framework used for physical health. This approach views a psychiatric disorder like type 1 diabetes as a localized hardware failure or a chemical imbalance inside the skull that requires a pharmaceutical fix. These assumptions were tested by the global data collected during the 2020 pandemic. If mental health were a closed chemical equation, the acute stress and isolation of global lockdowns should have caused an immediate, universal decline in psychological well-being. Instead, during the first 6 months of the pandemic, average global mental health scores actually improved as communities shared a singular collective challenge in close proximity. This points toward a specific neurological reality. The human brain functions as a social organ rather than a standalone computational machine. A clinical diagnosis that ignores this social context is incomplete. We often think of the brain as a calculating computer designed for abstract logic and problem solving. Imagine the brain's total capacity as an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. A single quarter placed on it represents the real estate dedicated to logic. The remaining 95% comprises the default mode network, dedicated entirely to processing social hierarchies and relationships. MRI data shows that the second a brain finishes a math problem, it automatically defaults its metabolic energy back to this social matrix. Because of this hardwiring, the nervous system reacts intensely when social connection is severed. During experiments with acute social exclusion, researchers found the brain's abstract emotional centers show little activity. Instead, social rejection activates the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. These are the same neural pathways that register physical tissue damage. Because the biology is identical, clinical trials show that standard over-the-counter painkillers like Tylenol significantly reduce the physical agony of social heartbreak. The nervous system processes social isolation and physical injury through the exact same internal hardware. Executing the act of suicide requires a brain to override its primary evolutionary mandate to survive. Thomas Joiner's interpersonal theory of suicide identifies the specific psychological conditions that make this possible. The first requirement is thwarted belongingness, profound social isolation. The second is perceived burdensomeness, the cognitive distortion that your existence is a liability to your loved ones. When these collide and are fueled by hopelessness, the risk of suicide becomes critical. This model challenges the assumption that mental illness itself is the direct cause of suicide. One study compared a suicidal depressed cohort against a group that was depressed but not suicidal. The variable separating the two groups was their score on loneliness rather than their clinical diagnosis. This data establishes a necessary boundary between suicide and non-suicidal self-injury, like cutting. When the body is wounded, the nervous system releases a surge of endorphins. For someone in psychological torment, this acts like a sudden shock absorber. Self-harm is a dysfunctional survival tactic used to temporarily mute pain, rather than an attempt to end life. Treating a self-harming patient with a suicidal framework is dangerous. It can implant fatal cognitive scripts into a brain trying to survive its own pain. These clinical trajectories are often determined by external environments and peer networks. Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiments illustrate how we learn and mirror the behaviors we observe. A common takeaway is the belief that witnessing violence automatically creates violent tendencies in children. Bandura's actual matrix provides a nuanced view. If a child observed a hostile model on both days, their behavior was aggressive. However, if they saw a peaceful model on the second day, the aggressive behavior completely vanished. A single stabilizing social anchor can neutralize toxic behavioral modeling. This protective buffer is often missing in the most extreme breakdowns of social safety. Sociological autopsies of the Columbine High School massacre analyzed the shooter's environments leading up to the event. Researchers found no evidence of a spontaneous biological chemical imbalance or isolated psychosis. Instead, the perpetrators existed in a systemic formula of family degradation and chronic peer rejection that stripped them of their dignity. These histories suggest that mass violence reflects a community ecosystem that failed to provide the necessary social buffer against alienation. To understand true resilience, we have to look at the conclusion of the pandemic tracking project. This line graph tracks global mental health scores across the first 6 months of the 2020 lockdowns, showing a remarkably stable baseline. Exactly at the 6-month mark, the data splits. One group plunged into pathology, while the other rose toward resilience. This divide was not determined by wealth, geography, or genetic predisposition. The deciding factor was the maintenance of structural social anchors, rituals, and visual reminders that connected individuals to their communities. This psychological framework is visible even in low-status employment sectors. Studies on workplace satisfaction show that while some corporate elites report high rates of internal emptiness, some public school janitors register exceptionally high rates of sustainable happiness. High-happiness janitors view their roles not as manual labor, but as providing a sanctuary that allows the children in their community to flourish. Wealth and chemical neutrality are poor predictors of sustained happiness compared to the capacity to infuse labor with systemic meaning. As the data shows, true mental health is ultimately derived from your active participation within a broader human network. Fostering resilience requires moving the clinical focus away from the isolated biological brain and toward the social ecosystem it inhabits.